your seats and turn your attention to the stage for Ms. Deborah DiSanzo, General Manager, IBM Watson Health, and Lauren Smith, Managing Director, FSG.
Right, exactly. So then you end up looking through all of these. Right, I guess that was it. Well, you all quiet down so nicely. You're very obedient. Good for you. That's awesome. Well, my name is Lauren Smith, and I'm the managing director at FSG, and I run our U.S. health practice. And I'm just thrilled to be able to be here with Deborah DiSanzo and really to start off this conversation about the really incredible work she's doing with her team at IBM Watson. I will share with you, we didn't even get to say this yet, but it's been 30 years that I've been in medicine, and I would say over those 3 decades, the transformation of what is happening in medicine has just been extraordinary. And there are things now that we just would never have expected or predicted. We've been fortunate to see some illnesses be almost eradicated, where we've had others, both infectious and chronic, develop and emerge partly as a result of environmental exposures and other kinds of situations. So the opportunity to think about the application of artificial intelligence and the disruptive power that that has within the healthcare system and the ability to apply that to the many challenges that we face now. It's just really exciting. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Pleasure. Real pleasure.
So we will just jump in then without further ado. And I guess I would love to start, for those of you who may not know your story, maybe you could just spend a minute or two telling us about how you ended up at IBM Watson.
Lauren, thank you. So like you, I've been in healthcare technology for 30 years. The first program I ever worked on was with the University of Pittsburgh, and I was at another tech company, and we networked together workstations to give the ability for neurophysiologists to see into every single operating room. And then I went and I did a lot of things in healthcare technology. The small defibrillators that are on planes and airports, my team and I are accredited with building that market. And I was doing a lot of things. I was working for I was the CEO of a very large healthcare technology company. And, you know, in healthcare technology, everything stayed the same, really, until about 2012, when everything started to change. Everything started to change, both because of market dynamics and also because big data, artificial intelligence was coming. And I was sitting and going, all I've ever wanted to do is work at the intersection of healthcare and technology and make a difference in technology with health. And I've got to be somewhere that is going to make a difference with data and artificial intelligence. There's just so much you can do with understanding data and algorithms. And so I went and talked to nearly everybody because of who I was. The doors opened, and I decided to go to IBM because of Watson, because I saw what IBM had going on in IBM research, how far ahead they were of everyone. But the most important, because I thought maybe I want to go to a startup. Maybe a startup is where you can make an impactful difference. But quite frankly, IBM's commitment to healthcare, Ginny's commitment to healthcare, IBM's commitment to Watson and AI combined with healthcare, I said, this is where we can create shared value. This is where we're going to make a difference in healthcare.
Well, that's a great then segue into my next question, which is around, there are so many different challenges that we face in healthcare now, in terms of the magnitude of information that a provider has to master, the contraction and constriction of the amount of time that a provider, I could say, someone like me, would have to spend with a patient. As well as the multitude of issues and concerns outside of the patient-doctor interaction that have such an impact on health. And Bruce Broussard of Humana talked a little bit about this earlier today, about their interest in food security and isolation as examples. How is IBM Watson positioning itself to be able to address some of those challenges?
Well, I'm glad you started with physicians, and I think that this is not primarily primarily a healthcare group. So let me just give some of the statistics. Actually, in our country now, the statistic is that 50% of all physicians are suffering some type of burnout. So I mean, if you're a patient, you don't want to think that your physician is suffering some type of burnout. Primary care physicians on average work 11.2 hours every day, and 6 of those hours are spent in playing with the technology and in the electronic health record, which is adding to the burnout. And now we're going to take that and we're going to couple it with the fact that there's a shortage of primary care physicians. There's a shortage in the world of oncologists. The estimate is there's something that's going to be a 25 million physician shortage in the US by 2025. So this is a real problem. And we thought, well, how can Watson, how can artificial intelligence help? And so many examples, but I think I'm going to talk about primary care physicians and the work that we're doing with Atrius Health, where we're from in Boston. We're working with Steve Strongwater, who is the CEO of Atrius Health, and really on the vision of how can we make it far simpler for a physician to interact with the technology. So we're doing a joint program together. First of all, your electronic health record in those systems is thousands of pages long. The electronic health record, if you spend a week at a hospital, your electronic health record is going to be the size of a Harry Potter book. And so it's really quite difficult.
And not as fun to read.
No, and your 15-minute visit to the primary care physician to read through all of that. So what we do very well, what Watson does very well, is an artificial intelligence technique called natural language understanding. So Watson reads the electronic health record. I mean, we do it in seconds to minutes. And then for Atrius, we are pulling up what that primary care physician likes to see about his patient. You know, what he determined last time, what the problem was, what the follow-up was, what the action was. And then we're showing, you know, here's Lauren, here's all Lauren's demographics, the treatment that she's on, and within the Atrius network, here are other patients that look like Lauren on the same treatment, and here is their outcome. So it's very, very powerful in helping the primary care physician go through all of that data and make sense of it.
Well, I'm so glad you brought up the idea of that interaction, because for me, I was an inpatient physician, but still had to spend just an extraordinary amount of time putting information into the medical record that took away the face-to-face time that I might have wanted to have with patients and families. And I'm just wondering, how is that playing out with using Watson in that way?
You know, I'm going to tell a small, quick story, and this is not necessarily about me, but it's public now, but 2 years ago I was diagnosed with breast cancer, and when I went to Dana-Farber, and Dana-Farber had just put in a new electronic health record system, and I was sitting with my nurse practitioner, and I don't think she knew that I ran IBM Watson Health, but she honestly sat there for an hour and complained to me about the electronic health record. And she would say, you know, before, this is how I used to do. I used to look at you face to face. I would have a conversation with you. And now I have to be looking in this thing. So I think I want to talk, since I just brought up cancer, Memorial Sloan Kettering was one of the first partners of IBM Watson Health. And Memorial Sloan Kettering's thought was, we want to bring the knowledge from Memorial Sloan Kettering to parts of the world that don't have it. And so with Memorial Sloan Kettering, we trained Watson to think like an oncologist. Now, if we get cancer in this country, you know, the oncologist to patient ratio is 1 to 143. But now go to China, it's 1 oncologist to 800 patients. Now go to India, it's 1 oncologist to 1,600 patients. Now go to Africa, it's 1 oncologist to thousands of patients. I mean, we really need help. And so our fastest growing markets for Watson for Oncology are actually China and India. We did another program for countries in Africa. And what we're finding is, if you go picture this, you're diagnosed with breast cancer in China. You are going to queue up in the morning at 8 a.m. At your hospital. You're going to wait for a couple of hours in the queue to where you will be seated in a large room with other patients, and your oncologist will come around, and you get 2 to 3 minutes with your oncologist. Oncologists don't like it, patients don't like it, but what Watson is bringing into that is Watson has read through your electronic health record. Based on Memorial Sloan Kettering guidelines, here's the treatment that Memorial Sloan Kettering would recommend. Based on this, here is some patient information that is useful for you. So you get your 2 to 3 minutes with your oncologist. Your oncologist gets the augmented intelligence of Watson, and both the oncologist and the patients are feeling much better about the treatment going forward.
Wow, that's a tremendous example. I mean, just to imagine trying to broach or to master just the reams and reams of data and information that are out there that are necessary to select the appropriate clinical trial for a given patient, and to sort of address that is really tremendous. I know one of the other areas that IBM Watson's been really involved in is around drug discovery, and I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how that's going.
So you're probably all not experts in drug discovery either. So there's usually an 8-year cycle in drug discovery. The front end of it is finding the molecule or finding the immunotherapy gene. It takes 18 months to 2 years, and then once that's found and the pharma company decides to go forward, you go through phase 0, 1, 2, 3 clinical trials to commercialization. So in this front bit of it, what life sciences researchers typically use are search techniques. Search through the molecules that exist, or new molecules to find connections that can start you. So Watson for Drug Discovery was really developed in IBM Research, but we have very good partners, including Pfizer, who help with the ongoing training of it. And what Pfizer researchers do is they use Watson for Drug Discovery. It allows you to search for genes, molecules, proteins from existing literature. So Watson has read in every drug patent since 1860 and annotated it with 10 billion annotations talking about molecules and how they affect disease. We've read in every single PubMed article, 24 million of them. And so you can sit down, a life science researcher can sit down now with Watson for Drug Discovery and search for, show me all the articles for patients with coronary artery disease that have drug-eluting stents and went back for treatment and what worked for them. And by this constant looking and connecting, we can come down to some drug targets. So Barrow Neurological Institute in Arizona used Watson for Drug Discovery to understand genes that relate to ALS. Watson ranked 1 to 1,500 genes that Watson thought could affect ALS. Barrow then took those and said, yes, these top 10 do affect ALS, and 8 of them we had never seen before. And so now Barrow is going forward to see if further drug discovery on these 8 genes.
Well, as you talk about just the incredible potential for impact of these kind of innovation and these new efforts that you're developing, how are you all thinking about the potential that their equity requires that, if you want to have an equitable outcome within ALS or multiple sclerosis or any of the other kind of illnesses that you're thinking about, how are you thinking about access to this really critically important and innovative resource? Because we know that if we don't think intentionally about that, it could actually widen some of the disparities inadvertently.
So data helps a lot. Right. I mean, the more data, the more varied the data helps a lot. In the old days, when we couldn't read in large quantities of data, the data you had and the data that a human could read through was all you had available to you. And so there would always be bias into the subset of data that you look at. There's still bias in the subset of data that you look at, but the more data you add, and you can add more and more data if you're using artificial intelligence to read through it, then the less bias you have, the more equity that you will have. So I think you can't completely take out bias. You can't get to a complete equitable place, but we can, the stuff that we can do with simply reading through, calculating through much, much more data than we ever could before. Every quarter, Watson reads in about 5 million pages of health data. Every new clinical trial, every new publication, it reads through it. And that ensures that you're always getting the newest information in to help with the decision making.
Wow, that's fascinating. That democratization of data is such an important concept. We're getting several questions that jive with a little bit with where I was going to go next, which is around some of the concerns or apprehension that some folks have when thinking about artificial intelligence and big data. While there's such promise, there's also some concerns, and perhaps not unfounded concerns, because we are hearing about data breaches and intrusions in privacy, or people misusing or just losing control of the information. So how are you all thinking about that?
First of all, a little luckily in healthcare, I will say that we have had for a long time, both in the US and in Europe and now in China, really very strict privacy policies, which means so all the data that we take in is, we take out all the personal...
anonymized.
Thank you very much, anonymized. So it's then difficult to get back to, actual people data. So that's one. Number two, we're very lucky that we are in IBM, and IBM has phenomenal security software that helps protect it. But we have to be vigilant. We have to acknowledge IBM has the 3 principles of AI that starts with your data is your data. Your data does not belong to IBM. Your data is your data, and we will protect it, adhere to all the privacy requirements, that word, and go from there. So in our data lakes, there is no personalized, identified information on the data, but we all have to watch that extraordinarily carefully.
Yeah. Well, one of the things you talked about was at the beginning was around clinicians sort of wanting to have a different kind of approach or different kind of interaction with patients and not having the technology come between them. And so one of the questions, or several people have asked a question about what kind of retraining is required within the health field in order to position clinicians to be able to take maximal advantage of the kinds of disruptive innovation that you're helping to create.
I said at the beginning that I've been doing healthcare technology for 30 years, and up until 2012, nothing really changed. Part of that was adoption of healthcare technology always took a very long time. I knew technology maybe 7 to 10 years. It just took a long time. Because the issues that we're having now are so acute. I mean, we never had before 50% of primary care physicians suffering burnout, and we were never going to this large shortage of clinicians, and we're getting older and sicker. So we're finding a much different adoption mentality among the clinicians now. Medical schools are talking about how do we train for artificial intelligence, augmented intelligence. How do we train physicians that these tools are going to be available to them when they get out of school, so they know how to interact with them? We have systems like Atrius, like Memorial Sloan Kettering, like Mayo Clinic, like Cleveland Clinic, like Kaiser, adopting the tools, really bringing them in, working with their clinicians to use them. So really in my whole career, I've never seen such a take-up of technology as I do in this. Watson for Oncology, clinical trials matching, and Watson for genomics have been commercialized only since January of 2016. And we have 55,000 patients that have been processed through those tools. 55,000 patients, and we have over 230 hospitals. That's extraordinarily fast in healthcare technology to get that fast. So there is an awareness that there's a lot of data, no human can read this much data, and that augmented intelligence can help, and how do we work effectively with it?
Well, you've mentioned several of the kinds of challenges facing U.S. healthcare, or healthcare in general, and I'm wondering if there are some other ones that you could tell us about how you're thinking about using IBM Watson. You talked about physician burnout. You talked about sort of the decrease in the number of primary care physicians. What about, sort of the decreasing access in rural areas, other kinds of issues facing healthcare now? Or how are you seeing?
Let's see.
deploying Watson?
I think let's talk about diabetes. And let me switch it from physicians to really to people. Type 1 diabetes, and type 2 diabetes is now an epidemic in our country and in the world. We worked together with Medtronic to develop an app for Sugar.IQ is an app for type 1 diabetes, but we are going to mirror it for type 2 diabetes as well. So the app connects to Medtronic's continuous glucose monitor, and Medtronic has now received FDA approval for this whole system. We'll start selling it in June. We created an app that connects to their Guardian continuous glucose monitor called Sugar.IQ. And we did something really hard with the app. We analyzed 200, then 600, then 10,000 of Medtronic's patients and their CareLink data, and we created an algorithm that can predict the onset of a hypoglycemic event when your blood sugar goes low and you pass out. And you usually only know that that's going to happen maybe up to 5 minutes before. We created an algorithm that can predict it up to 3 hours before with an over 90% accuracy. So that's very hard thing to do. We did that, but then we did some really simple things. The app gives you the ability to watch. I got up in the morning, I walked, what happened to my blood sugar? I got up in the morning, I ate cantaloupe, what happened to my blood sugar? How many minutes of the day have I been within my glucose range? How many have I been outside? And at the very last moment before the clinical trial, we did this gamification thing and just let patients follow their favorite foods. Just follow your favorite foods. It was the last thing we put in the app right before we went to clinical trials. It was the most used part of the app. 78% of the patients in the trial followed foods. Now this was remarkable.
What is following foods?
I got up in the morning and I went to my favorite coffee shop and I had my favorite coffee, and what did that do to my blood sugar? So you'd put in what you wanted to follow. And what do you think the number one food was that these type 1 diabetics wanted to follow to see what it did to their blood sugar?
I'm pretty sure I don't want to know.
Well, it was Dunkin' Donuts. So this was amazing. So I say, right? So it was amazing. So Dunkin' Donuts was first. The fifth one was buttermilk biscuits. Panera Bread was in there. Pizza was in there. But what we saw was, because there was immediate feedback. I'm following this food, this is what happened. Every day you eat Dunkin' Donuts, this is what happens to your blood sugar. We found a real behavior shift that we're all looking for. What's the behavior shift? So you eat something, you see what happens to your blood sugar. We found that type 1 diabetes in the clinical trial spent 37 more minutes a day within their range, and type 1 diabetics only are in their range on average half of the day. So 37 minutes makes a big difference, and 65% of the patients had fewer highs and 55% of the patients had fewer lows. So it made a real big difference. Medtronic is starting to sell in June, and I just really am very anxious to see how this helps type 1 diabetes. Yeah.
What a great example. And for those of you in the audience who aren't clinicians, if you can increase, essentially you were adding almost a whole hour of, being within range. That's a tremendous outcome. And if there was an opportunity to do more of that, that's really exciting.
Yes, yeah.
One of the things that I know we're going to end up soon. Do you think that there are other kinds of social issues that Watson could take on? You're talking about health, but are there other things that you think it could? That was one of the questions that someone came up.
Well, Watson's being used in a variety of industries. We might not think that financial regulatory is really a social issue, but we could think that actually it is. And the same things apply of reading really fast and understanding what is within compliance, outside of compliance. We're working in hospitality, we're working in banking, we're working in oil and gas. We're really working in every industry, but health is really my thing and the thing that I can speak the most about.
That's wonderful.
Lauren, thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you
Thank you
all. Introduce the next person who's going to be coming up. And that is Daniel Epstein of Unreasonable Group. And welcome him to the stage. Unreasonable, I have to say, this was going to be my favorite intro, and I totally blew it. So, Unreasonable.
Thank you so much. Okay, let's just make certain this works before we jump through. Old guy slide, we're perfect. Well, so my name is Daniel Epstein. I'm founder of a small organization with a big vision called the Unreasonable Group. And for the next 15 minutes, I have the privilege of telling you a little bit about what we do. I think more importantly, why we do that work, and probably most importantly, how it relates to the conversation here around shared value. Before I do that, I want to begin with a little bit of gratitude. Thank you to the Shared Value team for giving me this opportunity, and to all of you for lending me your ears and hopefully your eyes for the next 15 minutes. With that debt of gratitude, I think I should return the favor and rationalize a seemingly irrational name, which is, why do I run an organization called Unreasonable? This is the Irish playwright George Bernard Shaw. George Bernard Shaw is famous for saying that the reasonable man adapts himself to the world, the unreasonable one persists in adapting the world to himself. Therefore, all progress depends on the unreasonable person. If George Bernard Shaw is right, if all progress depends on the unreasonable person, then in a world where 1.3 billion people don't have access to electricity, where 770 million people don't have access to clean drinking water, in the world that we live in today, if George Bernard Shaw is right, we can't afford not to bet on unreasonable individuals. So about a decade ago, when I set out on founding this organization, the Unreasonable Group, what I quickly learned is, like everybody in this room, we're not alone in this quest to define progress in our time. And I stumbled upon the United Nations. This was when I was a university student. And I learned about the UN Millennial Development Goals. And for those of you who aren't familiar, in the year 2000, the United Nations came together. They set out a charter, the UN Millennial Development Goals. They said that we are going to hit these goals by 2015. There were a little bit over 10 goals, but number one on that list, the most important goal that the United Nations determined for humanity was to halve the number of individuals living in absolute poverty. And everybody was on board with this. Nearly every nation in the world. This is the largest ratified treaty at the time in the history of humankind. It's actually not billions, it was trillions of dollars behind this. We had the global infrastructure to pull it off. Even Bono was behind the Millennial Development Goals. And the question is, what happened? If we zoom in on the region of the world that was most hard hit by absolute poverty, if we look at sub-Saharan Africa, we can see that the numbers aren't that good. There was a decrease between 1990 and 2010, 44.6% of the population to 44%, living on less than $2.50 a day. What's most egregious about these statistics is that because of population growth, in terms of absolute numbers, there are 140 million more people living in absolute poverty in sub-Saharan Africa today than there were when we went about setting those goals. Now, Einstein has a definition of insanity. For those of you who haven't heard it, it's doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. As an organization at Unreasonable, we've taken this to heart and we decided that we need to look at this in a different way. How might we do that? We look to entrepreneurs. Now, this word is incredibly hard to spell. I've written it tens of thousands of times. Its roots are French and could be interpreted to mean to take into one's own hands. We believe so much in entrepreneurs because where most of the world sees market failures, issues, and problems, entrepreneurs, they have a curiously warped perspective. We look at the same thing and we see market opportunities and solutions, and then we have an impatience about having those ideas. We have to will them into existence. What we've learned over time, though, at Unreasonable is that entrepreneurs, I used to say entrepreneurs are the answer to every single issue that we face today. What we learned is actually that isn't quite true. That it's not just about working with the most disruptive, fast-growing breakthrough technologies that can solve our hardest problems. We need to align with the corporations that can help them scale globally. And this is our definition and our approach and of our strategic vision for what shared value is. So what I'm going to do is actually make this real and tell you stories of a couple entrepreneurs that we've worked with over the years. A lot of people ask us how we do this and how we align with some of the world's most impactful entrepreneurs is through partnerships with these very large respected brands and companies. And the one I'm going to talk to you about today and that we're going to dive in after this session is Unreasonable Impact, which is in partnership and was co-founded and co-created with the team at Barclays. So to make this real, I'm going to tell you stories of a couple entrepreneurs and how they're working with big brands. It's one of my favorite people alive. Actually, all these people are some of my favorite people alive, but this is Uma. Uma grew up in India. He always had the dream of becoming a doctor. He wanted to become a heart surgeon, and he wanted to work at the Mayo Clinic. He had lofty dreams growing up where he did, in the family that he did, but when he went out to take the test, and actually he'd probably kill me for saying this right now, this is live stream, so hopefully Uma isn't tuning in. He's too humble for me to say this, but in India you have national exams when you're applying to medical school. He was the #1 student in all of India. He ranked the highest in all of India on those exams, and so through a lot of struggles and a lot of time, he finally made it to the Mayo Clinic. After actually becoming a brain surgeon, he became an open heart surgeon, and he was working with stem cells in open heart surgery. And when he was working with stem cells, he realized that stem cells, they're regenerative. They grow on top of themselves, they multiply upon themselves. And he remembered back to earlier in his childhood, when it was his birthday, he was turning 10 years old. It was his birthday, and in the front of the house back in India, they were eating meat. In the back of the house, he learned that they were slaughtering the animals, and he saw that. And that had made him into a vegetarian ever since his 10th birthday. But when he was an open heart surgeon, he was working with stem cells, he realized, well, hang on, we can grow tissue. Cells can actually self-multiply. Why can't we apply that to meat? And so Uma created a company called Memphis Meats. Some of you might have heard about it in the news. They are literally creating meat from stem cells without the need to kill animals. Today, globally, we kill 70 billion animals every single year for consumption. If you look at global warming, this is one of the hardest trends to get over. It's how we farm and how we, in essence, manufacture meat. Memphis Meats is going out to change that. They're creating the first clean meat, no slaughter, 99.999% less land use, 99.999% less water consumption, zero methane, zero emissions, because they're not actually raising the cattle through life, just the stem cells. This is actually a picture of their chicken. The last one was their meatball. It is delicious. The question is, how is this relevant to big companies? Well, two of their largest backers with Memphis Meats, Tyson and Cargill, they know that this is the future of meat production. And by the way, we can halt climate change in its tracks with innovations like these. This also happens to be most likely a billion-dollar company. Another entrepreneur I want to talk to you about is Xavier. Xavier also was too smart for his own good. He was at Oxford University. He decided to take a trip to sub-Saharan Africa. Specifically, he went to Tanzania. And when he was in Tanzania, he saw a scene that looked something like this. This is a group of girls studying at night. On the African continent, 3 out of 4 people live without access to electricity. Still today, 3 out of 4 people don't have access to electricity. When you don't have access to electricity, if you're going to study at night, you're typically going to use one of these, which is a kerosene lantern. What we don't think about when we think about kerosene is that this is actually burning jet fuel. For the girls who are studying next to this, or anybody living inside of a house that's using kerosene lantern or a hut, it's the equivalent of smoking 2 packs of cigarettes every single day for every man, woman, and child in that house. It's a massive issue. Xavier looked at that, felt like we ought to be able to do something about that, and he was at this point in time looking at solar. So he launched a new company called Off-Grid Electric. So this map, this is Tanzania. You can see Mount Kilimanjaro up in the corner. It's on the border of Kenya. And this is in 2012. They launched a pilot project. How can we replace kerosene lanterns with solar at a price that's cheaper than kerosene? This shows their pilot project. You can see these yellow dots appear. Each yellow dot is a new household that went from kerosene to solar. The reason they can do this is individuals live in absolute poverty in these markets. They're spending about 20% of their income on kerosene for lighting. Xavier, his company Off-Grid, they can give you a solar system for less than that, and after about a year, you will actually own that. You pay through it through your cell phone. Who are their biggest backers? GE Ventures and Total Energy. Makes sense. They're looking at companies like Off-Grid Electric, feel like this is the next GE of the African continent. Another entrepreneur, Ian, is a young student living out of Pittsburgh when the earthquake hit Haiti. And like many of us, he wanted to do something about it. He was a student at that time. He was at a bar with a friend, and he was telling his friend, we got to do something, we got to do something. And apparently his friend said, stop talking about it, just do it. And he literally bought a plane ticket one way down to Haiti, had no idea what he was going to do there, but knew he had to go. And the next morning, he found himself in Haiti. And when he was there, he saw something like this. He really saw two problems. One is that if you're going to rebuild the economy, you have to have jobs. There's no getting around it. Two is there's plastic trash absolutely everywhere. So an entrepreneur with a warped perspective saw a huge market failure, but he saw an opportunity and created a company called Thread. They today employ over 4,000 individuals who 2 to 3x their income and go around the streets of Haiti, pick up the trash. They convert it into this material, almost looks like a yarn. They convert it into thread. How does this relate to brands? They partner with some of the world's largest brands. Most entrepreneurs really struggle, myself included, to give a 30-second pitch. Somehow they made an 18-second video that describes their whole company that I want to share with you really briefly. So that product line for Timberland was the #1 selling SKU on their website the first month it went out. So this stuff works. It's more profitable. It's creating jobs. It's taking trash off the streets. In essence, they're creating trash. They're taking trash and converting it into something very profitable. I like to refer to entrepreneurs like Ian as alchemists. Two more examples. We worked with a group of former NASA scientists and engineers. Their job when they're at NASA was to figure out how do we terraform Mars. Pretty cool job. They went around to some of the most remote regions on this planet that were similar in harsh environments to Mars and tried to figure it out. What they realized is that before we terraform Mars, before we make Mars livable for species, we actually need to re-terraform Earth. If you look at the stats, we need to plant 300 billion trees to get back to homeostasis in regards to climate change. And so they decided to focus their energies here. And they launched a company that's, in essence, drones for good. Their company is called Biocarbon Engineering. This drone, it's their first prototype today. It can plant 100,000 trees in one day with one operator. The drone that's above it, it flies autonomously. It analyzes the topography and the soil below it. It communicates to the drone that has an air gun that literally shoots tree pods into the ground based on the communication with the drone above it. Who is their largest investor? Who's their largest partner? It's the largest drone company in the world, Parrot. Just makes sense. Very excited about this company. Their goal is to close that gap to literally plant 300 billion trees within the next 20 years. They can do it, and it's wildly profitable. Last company I'm going to tell you about, last entrepreneur, individual, is truly one of my favorite human beings, and she's sitting right here. This is Jennifer. Afterwards, we're going to have a session with Jennifer to dive into her amazing work. But Jennifer retired, and she'll tell a little bit more of her story at one point, and then stumbled upon a technology that she couldn't turn her back to. Jennifer's background, she's a biochemist, and realized that she and her team could do something truly remarkable. Now, most of us, when we see an image like this, we see pollution. We see climate change, we see global warming, we see huge costs, we see taxes, whatever it might be. Jennifer and her team, they are true alchemists. They look at this and they see dollar signs. They see ability to capture this and turn it into something valuable. How do they do that? Her company is called Lanzatech. This is their first prototype based in China. It's a process of fermentation. They literally ferment pollution. So carbon monoxide and carbon dioxide. This is a steel mill. You can see there's a smokestack there. Normally emissions would be going out of it. She's liquefying it and piping it into that tank. Looks just like a beer fermentation tank. They've bioengineered microbes so that with these bioengineered microbes and water and pollution, they can ferment carbon monoxide and carbon dioxide into both ethanol, which is jet fuel, and polyethylene, which is plastic. You can literally make jet fuel and plastic out of pollution. If you don't believe me, this is that pilot project gone to scale, which Jennifer will talk about. This plant here, once it's operational, is the equivalent of taking 80,000 cars off the road every single year. This is very profitable for the oil refineries and steel mills that they partner with. So how can brands work with companies like Jennifer's and Lonzatech? Boeing and Virgin Atlantic are a very good example of how you could do it. This year, they're going to take off on the first flight ever, a commercial airliner across the Atlantic powered on jet fuel made from pollution. That's happening this year. I Googled it, and I don't know why it says Hot 50 on there, but it just showed up. But this is real. This is Jennifer and clearly Richard Branson going about making history together, using business as a powerful force for good. Some of you are probably sitting back and wondering, so all of these companies I just mentioned, that are part of our partnership with Barclays, Unreasonable Impact. And you may be thinking like this dog, okay, so what's in it for Barclays? How does this work? We just mentioned a lot of other companies. We survey our entrepreneurs. We have a lot of different data points. One of the really important questions is this one, which is after Unreasonable Impact, would your company consider partnering with Barclays? And as you've seen from the examples I've given you, these entrepreneurs are the future titans of industry. So if they can partner with Barclays, this is a magnificent opportunity. In our last program, we had 11 companies. The average company had raised into financing or made in revenue already $80 million. And at the end of that, because of this partnership and because the team at Barclays added so much value, when we surveyed the companies, across the board is unanimous. They said 5, which is we see Barclays as the most strategic bank to partner with. This is just smart business. Whether you invest in these entrepreneurs, you align with them, you add value to them, you connect them by working closer with them and adding value to them today, they're going to work with you into the future. Broadly speaking, we have 118 entrepreneurs in our global community. They've raised over $2 billion in financing, generated over $1 billion in revenue. They've impacted over 400 million lives. You're probably looking at this statistic, seeing 240 countries of operations, saying there aren't 240. I sat down with our engineering team, had the same question, and they said that's because we're looking at countries and territories, so places like Puerto Rico. So literally every country, every territory in the world, these 118 entrepreneurs, they're touching at least one live, and they all want to work with you. I think in closing, just from a philosophical framework, this is how we think about shared value. Most of the world used to see a division that looks something similar to this: the nonprofit and the for-profit communities, the private sector and the public sector, doing well and doing good. In reality, I think that if we added a dimension to it, most of the world would have agreed actually it's an X and Y axis. And the higher up you are, the more money you're making, and the further to the right you are, the more good you're doing. And maybe that dot in the top left corner, maybe that is not to offend anybody, but let's say a Goldman Sachs investment banker, not a Barclays investment banker. Just joking. And if you scoot over, if you drop down to the bottom, I'm trying to get this right, bottom right, maybe that's a Red Cross volunteer. Move up. This is an amazing elementary school teacher in a tough neighborhood. And if we move up into that top quadrant, I think that's typically where people used to think social entrepreneurs and social innovation live. What we're trying to prove, and we believe have proved with this partnership and Reasonable Impact, is that this is shared value. That actually you can't just do well and do good, but actually the most profitable companies in the world, the companies that are going to outperform all markets, are those companies that are doing the most amount of good in the world, that are going after solving the world's hardest problems. So with that, our fundamental value at Unreasonable is a belief that we is greater than I, that the only way we're going to achieve any of these lofty visions is through pathological collaboration, and hopefully by partnering with each of you. And so that's my email address. You can drop me a line if you want to get in touch. But more importantly, right after this session, we're running an hour-and-a-half session with Jennifer to jump into her business, figure out ways we can add value, and to explore this partnership a little bit more with the team at Barclays down in Ballroom A. So this is a shameless plug. For the next session, join us at Ballroom A. We'll get a lot more intimate and drop into it. And this slide shows where all the sessions are up and coming over the next hour and a half. Hope you join us. Thank you so much for lending me your ears and for joining us on this journey. Thank you.